Hi, and welcome back to another episode of Tuba People TV, where we talk about Arnold Jacobs all of the time. This is our first live interview, and we don't have dead interviews. This is our first interview since early March of 2020. I'm so excited to be here with Lawrie Bloom, who's the recently retired clarinet and bass clarinetist of the Chicago Symphony. 40 years with the CSO.
40 seasons. Yeah.
40 seasons, and prior to that with Cincinnati and Lyric, and Vancouver, and Phoenix. It's quite an enormous career.
It was great.
Yeah.
I was in those other four all kind of short, to the point my dad thought it was really funny to say, my kid can't seem to keep a job.
That's funny because Bud Herseth's son said he could never get a promotion. That's pretty funny. This is Lawrie Bloom. Lawrie, it's great to have you. Great to thank you for inviting us into your home, Puddles and I, and along the way with all of your orchestral positions, you had studies with Arnold Jacobs, and I've long been told this and have been looking forward to meeting with you and getting to hear about that. What drew you to Mr. Jacobs?
When I joined the Chicago Symphony, as you said, I've been with four other orchestras, and mostly conductors were like bass clarinet. And I got in the CSO, and Solti was, bass clarinet louder. I think he's the only guy ever who seemed to go deaf from the bottom up instead of the top down. And I wasn't sure how to do that. I knew how to play. I'd won the audition, but I wasn't sure how to develop the kind of volume they were talking without blowing my brains out my ears. And I'd always known about Jake, so I went back to the back row and said, Jake, could I work with you some? And took a series of lessons, and I think the first thing I said to him was, I've never experienced an orchestra with this kind of power, in the low range. And he chuckled. Well, it is sort of a powerful low end. It's like, yeah. And that started me working with them, and I like you, I got to experience being in the studio with him, and for those who've never seen his studio, he had all kinds of machinery, and I think that's what convinced me so easily that he was absolutely right. He'd say, he actually measured my capacity, which was one of the things he did with everybody, and said, you actually have a huge capacity, like the second biggest I've ever measured, which is, and the other guy wasn't much bigger than I am.
Wow.
But he said, you're not using it. And so we started working on that, and then he was also measuring output, but when you saw the needle go, you couldn't say, oh, this guy's making this up, it's just voodoo. I mean, it's like, oh.
So the equipment he used objectified
Absolutely.
what was otherwise subjective.
Absolutely. Up until then, what I'd been taught about breathing was not necessarily anatomically possible, and sort of conceptual, which I believe in teaching in a conceptual way, but it wasn't. You couldn't back it up with proof.
Mm-hmm.
You could say do this, and you'd try it, and like I say, I could play because I managed to win an audition or two, but he was. You say, oh, I trust this guy because he's showing me, he's backing up what he's saying with facts, with you know, and you look at the needle, you can't say, oh, no, he's crazy. I mean, it's like, no, he's right.
Mm-hmm. Do you happen to recall, it was a long time ago, what particular gadget he might have started you out on, or the piece of equipment that had the needle?
It seemed to me that the needle was at the expiration because I think he would measure inhalation, but he would also measure exhalation.
Right.
And I don't actually remember. I knew I did both of those things. I think he was measuring capacity by exhalation.
Okay, so
he would have
you breathe in and then
blow
out
into it. But he was doing it the opposite way also. So, you know, exhale and then breathe in fully, and he could measure. Maybe that would make more sense that was measuring capacity. But it was, for me, a new concept totally in how to breathe. I mean, he was the first person that ever mentioned to me getting your lips and your tongue out of the way,
oh, wow.
so that air could actually go in. You know, I mean, the quintessential middle school band player who's going, and they hear that noise and think, oh, I'm getting so much air, and of course they're not.
Yeah.
They're hearing it, but nothing's happening.
Yeah.
And so opening up in a very different way, saying, you know, your lungs are up here, not down here, so stop worrying about your diaphragm, and let your rib cage go up and out. Well, many of us on any instrument have been told, you know, don't raise your shoulders.
Right.
Well, when you do that, your shoulders will naturally go up, but it's not an artificial, it's not a musculature involved, it's just moving because the rib cage wants to expand.
Yeah, they're just floating up, and it's not a tension thing. It's just...
But allowing the musculature all along the sides and back to relax so the rib cage could really move was eye-opening.
Yeah,
you know.
yeah, for sure. So just getting you to breathe in more deeply, using more of the capacity that you have, and then so right there you're going to have more freedom of the air flowing out. But you'd mentioned at lunch a conversation that you had read.
Yeah, I think Jake and I mostly worked on inhalation, and we didn't talk about exhalation in an enormous amount, but I remember reading an interview or a conversation that had taken place between Bud, Adolph Herseth, and Jake, where they were talking about the difference in playing trumpet and playing tuba, that trumpet, you needed to use a very small volume of air moving at a high velocity, and that on tuba you needed to use a large volume of air moving at a slow velocity. And Jake, I think it was, said that's universal for any instrument creating sound with wind. The bigger the instrument, the slower the airflow. Nobody had ever suggested that to me before, but that did fit in with things I had learned. You know, going to school in Philadelphia, we were all aware of Tabuteau's work, even though I was long after Tabuteau. And him talking about, we all did this exercise where you would light a candle and blow over it and try to bend the flame but not blow it out. Well, you can't do that with fast air. You will blow it out, or you won't hit it at all. You have to just, you know, instead of, and that really changed the whole world of playing bass clarinet for me, because I realized I didn't have to work so hard. I could move this air quite slowly and get actually more result, not less.
Yeah.
And Jake didn't know anything about reeds or anything, obviously. I mean, he and I aren't going to talk about embouchure because at that point I knew a little more about clarinet embouchure than he did. But I realized quickly that essentially by blowing fast on bass clarinet I was overwhelming the reed. It just couldn't deal with that much air going by. But as a advanced clarinet player, you look at a bass clarinet and you think, oh, it's so big, I'm going to blow like that. And that's the classic mistake that most clarinet players, when they first pick up a bass, they're trying to blow the same. So that was, the sun came out.
Yeah.
And that was just reading that article and putting together with what Jake and I had worked on getting air in. Now it made more sense how I'm getting it out.
Yeah. In getting back to that first lesson, what did you notice, if anything, in your playing during the lesson or after the lesson?
Well, the first thing I noticed was the absolute freedom of getting air in. The way we were doing it. And we have an advantage on clarinet. We have this little barrel, and I would have my students take their barrel and stick it entirely into their mouth, and they don't want to do that. They want to, I'm like, no, stick it in far enough that your tongue is no longer possible to move, and then do a exhale and do a slow count of 5, trying to go evenly from empty to full. And that was Jake. It was 5.
Mm-hmm.
And because most of us want to take one breath and in 2 seconds we're full and we can't go any further.
Mm-hmm.
But by doing it that way, you actually got a lot more. But you also experienced this incredible freedom that there was no effort in taking this. I mean, Jake's famous saying, it was like, there's enough room, there's enough air in this room. We can take all we want, and
it's free.
You're not going to run.
Yeah.
It's just fuel.
Yeah.
I think and he would say things along the way, like, and I'm sure everybody who ever worked with him has heard this one. He said, "Your sound doesn't come from the air; it comes from here.
Mm.
So it's just fuel. Take as much as you want." Whereas I like, well, I'm not going to talk for other players. I thought, oh, my sound is totally dependent on the air, the quality of sound. And he's like, no, you need air to create sound, but what that sound is totally up to you. And that, again, was, okay, that makes total sense.
Yeah, so this conceptual, he talked conceptually with you.
Yeah, which I think is only fair. We were colleagues, and he was not going to too much talk down. And the other thing I think he said this, but this is certainly what I took from it, that I think before working with him, I thought of breathing like a bellows, that you went, well, if you do that, you can only start a note with an accent, some sort of accent, because you're holding the air, and the diaphragm wants to expel the air. But if instead of thinking vertically, you think circular, so then it's a lot easier to start notes, at least on a clarinet.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, that's true. And what I meant by conceptually was just he was talking to you about imagination with the sound and not just being totally physical about it, but actually just using your imagination.
It wasn't a new concept to me, but what I always said, which was my words, not Jake's, but the idea that don't ever try to solve a passage of music for technical reasons. Solve technical problems for musical reasons.
Bravo.
And it makes a big difference. My students were always fine if they thought about the music and stopped worrying about the technique.
Yeah, no, that's fantastic. Lawrie, certainly there must have been, there you were, sitting in the Chicago Symphony with these two gentlemen behind you, Bud Herseth and Arnold Jacobs. What did you learn from that?
You know, I didn't. I mean, you worked with Jake a lot.
Mm-hmm.
I didn't actually take very many lessons in his studio. I took a lot of lessons with him sitting behind me.
Yeah.
And Bud, as you say. I mean, the first time I heard Bud play the Hummel Concerto, I was like, wait, trumpets can't make attacks like that. I mean, he made attacks like a clarinet player.
Mm.
We can start the note and it's just there. And there was no ta, it was just like a singer.
Mm-hmm.
And I would listen to the two of them, and playing clarinet and bass clarinet, it was totally applicable to listen to both. And I'd listen to what Jake could do and how he could. I mean, I was 27 when I got that job, and he seemed ancient. And so for him to sustain a long line like the downward step in Prokofiev Romeo and Juliet, he couldn't exactly go, but he would have this little explosion of sound at the beginning of the note, and kind of, not percussive, but just kind of boom, 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 and you were like, that works, and on low instruments it works really well.
Mm-hmm.
But at the same time, I mean, I've never heard anybody play picture at an exhibition like Bud. You heard someone walking through a gallery. He didn't go dee da dee da. He went boom boom bim ba da boom.
Yeah.
You could feel the movement, and it was like, I want to do what they're doing on my instrument.
Mm. Yeah.
And I want to work as little as they sound like they're working.
Yeah, so efficient.
Yeah, so I mean, to me, efficiency is everything. Playing in a huge orchestra like Chicago that generates so much sound, you can't beat them. You have to be able to generate sound in a way that you're not going to fall dead.
Yeah, well, and especially when you think of how long they both played in the orchestra, well into their, Mr. Herseth, close to 80, if not 80.
I think just short of 80.
Yeah, and then Jacobs was in his 70s.
Yeah, it's kind of outrageous because you don't think of brass and woodwind players going that long.
Yeah. One of the things that struck home for me, one of the many things, was to go have a lesson. So there was a period of time when Jacobs was having cancer treatments, and he was teaching much of the time, teaching through them, and I would have a lesson with him in the Fine Arts Building, and he looked like death warmed over, just completely pale, and you could tell he doesn't have much energy, and just not feeling well. And then I would go hear him play 2 hours later in Orchestra Hall in the concert, and there's this big sound that would come out, and hit the sort of the background to that is he would say it doesn't take a lot of power or strength to play,
as long as you're not fighting yourself.
Exactly, and so it was that was something that to see in person really helped me to put those two ideas together, that you can sound really big and fat and not really work very hard while you're doing it. And certainly to play principal trumpet in a group like the Chicago Symphony for as long as Herseth did was.
But I mean, looking at Bud, you would think he was working hard because he was Norwegian descent, and his face would turn bright red.
Bright red.
Listening to him, you realized he wasn't working very hard.
Yeah. That's right. Jacobs went to college in Philadelphia. You went to Temple. Jacobs went to Curtis, and so he studied with Tabuteau. And I remember him talking about his classes with Tabuteau, that he took as often as he could. And just something that he passed on to us is the whole idea of note grouping or microphrasing. Not sure exactly what y'all call it in the woodwind world, but that's something that I've been teaching to my students. Is that something? It seems like it's just second nature for woodwinders, this whole idea of microphrasing.
Well, I think it's only second nature if somebody's introduced you to it. I assume what you're referring to is Tabuteau's numbering system, where you could divide up a phrase. You might be starting at a 2, and at the height of the phrase you'd be at a 5, and it makes a lot of sense, and it's easy to conceptualize what you're doing that way. I mean, you can come out a little mechanical if you're not careful, but it's a guideline that really makes a lot of sense. I took a class one time in creativity, and they were teaching at one afternoon, an efficiency expert named Laban quantified all movement into indirect or direct, fast or slow, and I was like, oh, this is how I should be teaching accents to my students, because all accents look the same, but they don't all sound the same. My students can tell you, I used to get them there over at Northwestern like 8 o'clock at night when nobody was around, and we would be dancing through the halls, because the best way to understand that stuff is put it in your body, do it physically. And it's the numerical thing is like that. It's like you're giving yourself a little reminder that this is where this is going. Now, if you don't really know where it's going, it won't help you to number it. But
yeah, and I think I'm not sure of exactly what you're talking about, but there was the idea was that microphrase consists of one, sometimes two, one or two, or sometimes three, almost never 4, and rarely 5 note groups. Is that sort of along the lines of what you're?
Yeah. Yes, I think that's
because Jacobs did talk about numbering system too, but it was described differently.
Well, you guys have fewer notes than we have.
We do have far fewer notes, so thank the Lord.
We were playing Don Quixote one time, and Gene was already in the orchestra, and I went back. I needed him to play a note a little bit sharp because that note was sharp on my instrument.
Right.
And I looked at his part, and I went back to the clarinets. I said, I'll never complain about bass clarinet parts again. It's like, all he had was whole notes in it. On the page I was looking at.
Yeah, of course. Yeah. No, that's interesting. And then I remember Jacobs talking about a dynamic numbering system also, where you would go from 1 to 5 and then 5 down to 1.
Right.
In terms of dynamics, is that something that you?
Yes, I think there's more dynamics in the way Tabuteau used it, but it was applied to where the phrase is.
Yeah.
I mean,
right.
where the subdivisions are that you want to clarify this for the listener. Well, you need to. Dynamic is a really good way to clarify things a lot of times. Yeah,
and then you had mentioned that McGill, David McGill has written a book that I've seen on my feed that I want to get. But it's very good.
It's a fantastic book, and he's very smart guy, very articulate, and much more articulate than I am in explaining, all this Philly stuff.
So, Lawrie, being in the orchestra for 40 years, I'm sure there were a number of tours that you participated in, and I'm really curious to find out anything that you'd like to, any memories of your tours, but also just in regard to Mr. Jacobs and Mr. Herseth even, stage door well-wishers and fans and these sort of things. I've heard of this from others, that there was maybe an unusually high number of well-wishers waiting for those two at the stage door post-concert.
we went on a lot of tours in 40 years. Solti loved to take pictures at an exhibition, not photos.
Yeah.
And for that, of course, everybody was waiting for Herseth and Clevenger.
Yeah.
And I've never seen anybody get so many solo bells as those two. You know, well deserved. I mean, it was unbelievable what they do. And I'm sure Jake was in on that. He was quieter and not, well, Bud wasn't looking for it, I don't think. It just happened. But yeah, there was always quite a crowd when you came out. Most of us they weren't really waiting for us. So, you know, we knew who they were waiting for, and then, you know, they were waiting for Solti too, of course.
Yeah.
I mean, all over the world, you know. And the first time I ever played in Royal Albert Hall on the Proms with Solti was, you know, for those who never witnessed that, the hall seats 6,000. Well, no, it can hold 6,000. The promenade in the old days was people literally walking around, and now they're standing. There's no seats, or there weren't when we have no idea anymore. And like students they would sleep there all night to get tickets.
Yeah.
And when we walked in, they would be there with scores, standing like right in front of the stage. But they also had this great tradition there where they would make up chants to each other usually, and they would call out something, and it was unbelievable how fast another group would create an answer and yell it back. We became the first orchestra to ever do something to them.
Really?
Penguin. They were known as the Arena, and we had a chant that started, "Penguins to the Arena." I can't remember what we said, but they went nuts because nobody had ever done that before. Oh. And Herseth, one time, you know, we're warming up, and he takes a camera out of his bag and takes a picture of the kids in the arena, and immediately they all went, "Arena to first trumpet, no photos allowed."
Really? That was so cool.
Yeah, it was. The Proms were very special. Yeah.
There's a Bruckner 7 from there. I don't know. I think it might have preceded you in the orchestra by a year or two. They where the ground floor was filled with young people, and they were absolutely silent. You know, through the Bruckner.
Yeah, it was fantastic. Of course, Solti lived in London. He was extremely popular there. They seemed to like us too. It was a great experience being at the Proms.
Now we were talking off camera. You went on that first trip to the former Soviet Union.
Yeah, right before the wall came down in Berlin, and Russia stopped being Russia, became a province again.
Right.
Right. Yeah, that was a very interesting trip because St. Petersburg was still in its Leningrad period, and I think it reconverted to being St. Petersburg like 2 weeks after we had been there. It was so interesting. I mean, architecturally, St. Petersburg is fabulous, and of course they have the Hermitage, one of the great art museums in the world. But it was a little drab in those days because things had not been kept up as much as one would hope during the. Well, I can't say during the communists, that's still going on, but it looks very different now. We went back 23 years later, and it's just gorgeous. And Moscow also had changed greatly. And on that tour, we went to Budapest. And Solti spoke to us in the rehearsal, and Solti was not a big talker in rehearsal, but he said, you know, for 40 years the music of Bartók was banned in Hungary by the communists. And he said, so many of these people do not know the music of Bartók, so we did an all Bartók program. with Andras Schiff playing with us, who's of course a wonderful Hungarian pianist. And that was one of the most emotional concerts I've been part of. I mean, it was a huge hall, not a great hall, but it was big audience, and they were so overwhelmed to hear this all Bartok program.
Wow.
It was fantastic. We did go back there years later and actually go to Solti's grave with Lady Valerie. And I remember I kind of was standing on the fringe of the group, and I was right next to the grave, and I looked over and went, "Wait, that's Solti. That's Bartok."
Wow.
They'd had his remains. You know, he was buried in New York originally, Bartok.
Oh, I didn't know that.
And Solti was, I think, involved in helping Bartok's sons to get the remains moved back to Budapest.
Wow.
And now they're next to each other.
And just recently we lost Lady Solti.
Yeah,
Yeah.
that was sad. They were good people.
They were good people. Yeah, for sure. So Lawrie, I mean, with all those tours, there must have been. Was there one or two that was your favorite or most memorable?
For musical reasons, the festival tour, and that takes, you know, we would go. Our usual vacation was like mid-August to mid-September, but when we did the European festival tour, that was August into September. Not only is the weather spectacular, but you're going to Salzburg and Lucerne and the Proms, and it's gorgeous. It's some of the great halls, some of the great audiences. Musically, that was it. Just as the most fun was going to Australia in '88 for their bicentennial, because it was winter in Chicago and it was summer down there.
Mm-hmm.
So, you know, I went to the beach every day. And we did all the big cities, so
Yeah,
that was fun.
that's great. And just to circle back, you know, with Jacobs, you had your time in the studio with him. You had your time listening from your workstation in the orchestra. What would you what did he do for you overall? What was, if you were to summarize?
He gave me a lot more confidence in my low voice. You know, like many clarinet players, I think I fought the bass clarinet for a while. My first job in Phoenix was assistant principal at bass, and I think in my pea brain, assistant principal was somehow more important to me, and I was kind of fighting the bass. You know, 4 years after leaving that job, and my fifth orchestra, I joined Chicago, and you know, I certainly had worked very hard on the bass clarinet to get that opportunity, but I realized, working with him and listening to him, what a voice it could be. And that really changed my approach to loving the bass clarinet. It didn't mean I didn't love the clarinet, but I could do things that I couldn't do on a clarinet. You know, it wasn't possible. Nobody could. You know, it gave me a voice. I used to play. There's a set of variations on Rigoletto that one of the former clarinetists from La Scala wrote, and I used to play it, going back and forth, one variation on clarinet, one on bass, and my teacher, Anthony Giglietti, heard me play that at one of the big clarinet congresses, and he said, "What, this piece isn't hard enough on clarinet?" And I said, "It's the greatest bass baritone role in history, and you're going to do it all as a soprano?" You know, so he made me really appreciate the lower instruments, not just as blending, but as a soloist, and the possibility of doing much more with it.
That's great. Yeah. So he really gave you voice to your voice.
Yeah, I mean, just as like sing. was like, oh yeah, I'm allowed to do that.
Yeah, that's great. Yeah. Well, Puddles, as always, has asked me to bring you a token of our appreciation, and so we'd love to give you this genuine Tuba People TV
I am honored.
pint glass. But
Does this make, Fritz once came up, we were playing Mahler 9 with the tuba and the bass clarinet go bum bum bum,
yeah,
and I think I had gotten tired of being blown off the stage, and I played that just absolutely as loud as I could. And Fritz came up afterwards and he said, "You're an honorary tuba player now."
well, you are definitely an honorary tuba player, and you have long been, and it's been so wonderful to finally officially meet you and talk with you. I wish we would have done this 38 years ago when I was back in Chicago.
Yeah.
You had just gotten in the orchestra. I'd just gotten to Northwestern as a student, but because you've just retired to Bend, Oregon, I can't leave you with just one glass, because I want you always to get to know people in your new community. So you can't drink alone. You have to always drink with somebody. So for that reason, we'd like to present you with 2 glasses. This is the first time this has ever happened.
I am honored, and for those of you who don't know so much about Bend, it's one of the great brewery towns in the country.
Yes,
so I will never lack for someone to share a brew.
Very good, and these are not dishwasher safe. So just know that the paint will come off if you put them in the dishwasher.
I will warn my wife, and I will try to remember.
Lawrie, thank you so much.
Thanks, Mike. It's been fun.
Definitely a great pleasure. So, and now back to you.